Today, armies pay professionals. Early Rome relied on landholding farmers. This video shows how after 107 BCE the poor joined the legions, and why it reshaped power. Many think one reformer did it. Evidence suggests shortages, and pay drew the capite censi. Skip it and miss how loyalty shifted to generals. What pulled a farmer from plow to stipendium? Italy just after 201 BCE smelled of smoke and trampled seed. In the lowlands of Campania and the hills that ringed Roma itself, plows lay idle where marching feet had passed. Oxen grazed among broken hedgerows, and in the evening the clink of manacles came from villas where chains had replaced the household labor of freeholders. What is a Roman man if not his plow? That question began to answer itself in the decades after the Second Punic War. The decision that reshaped the countryside was not sudden but cumulative. Hannibal's campaigns had kept men away from their fields for years. Dead ate into small farms. Captains and magistrates flush with booty invested in land and the cheapest labor, slaves. Wealth flowed into the hands of a few, and those hands turned mixed peasant holdings into latifundia. Rome's law and its magistrates still summoned citizens to the Doctus, relying on a Servian census that ranked men by property, yet the social bargain that tied soldier to soil was fraying. The state, distracted by further wars and seduced by empire, allowed that fray to widen. Action followed political arithmetic. Land sales accelerated, often by quiet legal means. Loans called in at harvest, lawsuits sharpened by juries drawn from the elite estate, purchases recorded in the Forum. Appian and Plutarch traced the bruise left by Hannibal across the rolls of the census. Not merely the missing names, but the shape of Rome's manpower. Where a village once returned 50 property-qualified citizens for the levy, it might now return 10. Where a patchwork of small farms had fed a squadron of men, a single villa consolidated those acres under one roof and scores of slaves. Archaeology confirms the change with tile and column. In district after district, the foundations of rustic farms lie under the foundations of opulent villas. The consequence was legal, social, and military. Magistrates continued to read the roll and to demand service, but more men answered with pleas of poverty. "I am capite censi." They might have said, capite censi. Men counted without property, and the law could not fold them into the traditional manipular line. Rome tried remedies: land grants for veterans, commissions to parcel out conquered fields, the 2 iugera allotted for every year of service under Scipio and Livy's record. Yet these acts were stopgaps, often allocated to veterans favored by office-holding patrons, or swallowed by the very landlords who profited from the war. Numbers helped the human story. In some settlements, the number of eligible soldiers fell by half or more, and contemporary commentators from Appian to later annalists thought Hannibal's shadow had hollowed the citizen militia. Modern scholars such as Mary Beard and Garnsey and Soller read the same signs and tie them to changes in law and demography, changes in marriage, inheritance, credit, and the influx of slaves that depressed wages and pushed smallholders to sell. Politics followed logistics. A levy that once assumed short campaigns and a farmer's return home now faced men whose farms no longer existed to be returned to. The result was a military political squeeze. Rome still needed men in arms to garrison far provinces and to patrol sea lanes. The census no longer reliably supplied them. The city's leaders faced an ancient choice: with new stakes, force men into service. They could not afford or adapt the army to men who had nothing to return to. The first response was administrative and ad hoc: land settlements, commissions, and recalls. The deeper pressure, though, was social. Dispossessed men drifted to Rome's neighborhoods, to the subura, where 1,000 voices could swell a mob, and a few good ears in the Senate could hear danger. And so the stage was set in fields now shaded by imported columns. The old militia thinned, magistrates still read names, but fewer hands reached for the spear. One aristocratic house would soon take a different tack, offering not just orders but provisions and plots to restore the very base that fed both army and Senate. What price would Rome pay when politics began to promise land as payment for loyalty? Dawn on the Capitoline in 133 BCE smelled of wet stone and sweat. Tiberius Gracchus stood with the forum below him like an amphitheater of need, and thousands of Romans, farmers, clients, and curious townsmen, crowded the steps to hear a single dangerous promise. For a century, the strength of Rome had been counted in plowshares, and the ductus depended on men who owned them. The mos maiorum enshrined that military service was the duty of the landowner. Tiberius decided that the collapse of small farms after Hannibal and the spread of slave-run latifundia could not be left to slow attrition, restore the levy. He took a political gamble. He brought an agrarian law to the concilium plebis, bypassing a senate that represented large landlords and jurors who judged their interests. Action followed with an urgency as practical as it was ideological. He created a land commission to reassign public aegir to the poor, aiming to put hoes back into hands fit for the spear. The result was immediate and explosive. Votes in the forum became confrontations. The law's defenders called on ancestral duty, its opponents on vested property. Senators weaponized the courts, and their clients' street violence answered ballots. Tiberius died in the melee on the Capitol's steps, struck down not in the field, but where Roman law was supposed to rule. His death was a signal politics could kill as readily as the enemy. Yet the decision he set in motion did not die with him. Gaius Gracchus, his younger brother, took up the gambit a decade later with a bolder program. Subsidized grain, reformed juries and land commissions that planted colonies to receive veterans and freedmen. But he too met a political death when his reforms collided with senatorial resistance and judicial poison. Land commissions did plant colonies, small victories were won. But the countryside stayed uneven. Villas and slave-run estates still stretched where patchwork holdings had been. The commission's plots were palliatives, not a wholesale restoration. Why does this matter for Rome's armies? Because each plot lost was a man lost to the traditional levy. Every farm swallowed by a villa shrank the pool of property-qualified soldiers. The capite censi, once excluded from full military status because they owned nothing, swelled in the city, men of military age who could not meet the property test. The Gracchi tried to reverse that drift, not merely for justice, but for pragmatism. A republic that cannot summon its farmers to arms is a republic dependent on other remedies. Their reforms recognized a simple arithmetic of manpower as much as a moral claim. Return land, and you return men to the standards. But politics had been bloodied. Property interests, juries, and violence had reshaped how laws were made. One can imagine 1,000 former smallholders watching the forum's arguments and asking whether Rome would still call them when the trumpet sounded. The consequence was paradoxical. For a moment, the state attempted to replan its soldier foundation by parcel and colony, yet the pattern of urban migration and economic concentration proved resilient. The Gracchian land commissions could not reverse decades of demographic and social shift, and Rome's levy thinned in practice, even as its boundaries and obligations swelled. The Republic had thus discovered blood in its own politics. A lawgiver fell before his law, and reform became a provocation to violence. The final chilling turn came not on the Capitoline, but across the Mediterranean. Numidia, a kingdom where Roman standards would soon be tested, where a war and a king would expose in ugly relief what the Gracchi had only hinted at, that the city could no longer reliably fill the ranks she sent to Africa. Who would answer the call when the trumpet sounded? Those who owned plows, or those who only owned allegiance to men with money to promise them? Dust and heat hung in the Numidian plain outside Cirta in the summer of 112 BCE. The stone houses blackened where fires licked merchants, stalls overturned, and the air smelled faintly of coin and blood. Jugurtha, the adopted nephew whose ambition had turned kinship into murder, sat like a prince of shadows. While the city's Italian traitors were slain or stripped, his victory was paid for not only with spears, but with silver slipped into Roman palms. Back in Roma, Sallust would later paint the picture plainly: commanders took gifts, as if offices were market stalls, and the call to arms, Dauctus, the formal call to arms, found many empty tents. The immediate decision in the forum was grim: send consular armies to Africa to check a client king, or let Numidia teach other provincials that Rome's teeth were hollow. The Senate ordered men to muster. Recruiters were sent to the campus Martius to beat lists, to bark orders, to shame the reluctant. Recruiters scraped the rolls and encountered a republic in retreat from its own mores. The Servian ideal of the citizen farmer had already thinned: land gone to large estates, smallholders driven to the subura slums, veterans back from Spain with ruined plots and creditors at their gates. The stipendium, once token and irregular, had begun to matter as much as farmland. The socii, who furnished their quotas for Rome's wars but lacked full franchise, seethed at the thought of dying for a city that withheld voice and law. Consular armies, set out more like assemblies of disparate clients than a united militia standards, a signum, the troops' emblem, were embarrassed in the field, captured or disgraced where once they had stood unshaken. Recruiters could raise only perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 volunteers from the citizen rolls when Rome needed legions by the tens of thousands, and the shortage was not merely arithmetic but moral. Men who once fought to defend plowshare and hearth now refused to leave a ruined harvest for an unpaid campaign. Action followed from necessity. Commanders marched ill-provisioned, dependent on allied contingents and mercenaries, and on the thin thread of loyalty paid by promises of loot. Consular dignity staggered under the shadow of bribery. A provincial king could buy off a commander's zeal, and Rome's prestige bled. Veterans who had bled abroad and returned to empty fields grumbled loud in the taverns and at the tribunals, demanding arrears and lands. The consul's decision to press the levy met with evasions. Men slipped away appeals to juries, fines levied and then remitted. The countryside offered fewer qualified men, the capite censi, those counted only by their heads, and not property, stood outside the old battle line. Consequence arrived in the person of Gaius Marius. Rome elected him in 107 BCE because the city wanted competence and plunder, a captain who could make up for senatorial paralysis in the field. He faced a stark choice at assembly: and camp, enforce the property rules and leave Africa unconquered, or adapt the levy to the age. His answer, born of exigency more than ideology, was to take men who had no farms to return to and give them a sword and pay. He streamlined equipment through state contracts, tightened training, and promised the men share in spoils where land was no longer the soldier's pension. The immediate result was military. Campaigns refocused, standards re-raised. But the political consequence was deeper. Soldiers now owed more to a general's promises of pay and plunder than to the ancestral call of the plow. What did Rome trade for those campaigns? For years, the smell of coin and the clink of state gear would precede legions across Italy, and a new question would haunt every muster: who will feed these men when the wars are done, and whose power will the hungry soldiers crown? January in Roma, 107 BCE, bit like iron, cold, sharp, and full of noise. The campus Martius thronged not with plowmen, but with petitions, the metallic clink of armor being tested against the cry of voters. The old levy ritual, the Dauctus, had become an empty liturgy for a republic that still imagined farmers carrying Rome's standards. The Servian census had long tied a man's duty to the acres he held, and now those acres were disappearing into villas and debts. Marius stood at that fault line not as an ideologue, but as a commander with a problem: an army to lead to Africa against Jugurtha, and too few property-qualified men to fill the ranks. The decision he made was hard-edged, practical, and portentous. He opened the gates to the capite censi, men counted at the census only by their heads, not by land. Plutarch insists he acted from necessity, not some republican dream of equality. Modern scholars, Adrian Goldsworthy among them, warn that what we call Marian reform was less a single thunderbolt than a series of bolts tightened under constant strain. He acted by reshaping the supply line of soldiers. Where once a man brought his own spear and shield, Marius set state contracts in motion so uniforms and weapons came from Rome's purse. The cohort block, cohors a tactical unit of soldiers, became the backbone 6 centuries per cohort, cohorts arrayed into a legion of roughly 5,000 men, drilled to move and fight as a single organism. He fixed the aquila, the eagle standard, as the legion's soul, and rally something men could swear to defend beyond the claim of any plot of land. The stipendium was formalized, and the promise of booty dangled like a new kind of patrimony for men who had no farm pay and plunder, were more tangible than ancestral custom. Who will fight Rome's wars when fields lie fallow? That question posed mid-decision explains why volunteers answered his call. The immediate action was simple and brutal. Rome gained legions that would go the distance. The state-acquired kit meant fewer excuses and fewer drovered absences. Drilling turned disparate volunteers into the disciplined tempo of marching columns. The consequence was as military planners intended and as political thinkers feared. For the first time in significant numbers, Rome's troops were men who carried no plow to return to men, whose retirement would depend on bounty pay or the goodwill of the general under whose sign they had fought. A legion now was not merely a temporary duty roster, but a social instrument that could be maintained by promises as much as by law. The stipendium and the lure of spoils became magnets where acreage once drew loyalties. Veterans who had marched for years and won deserts and rivers to Rome's glory would later expect fields in which to lay their heads. The immediate military payoff was undeniable. Marius could and would use those troops to fight the Cimbri and Teutons, and to restore discipline where disaster had loomed. But the political arithmetic had shifted forever. An army that begins as a solution to a manpower crisis arrives home as a constituency, men bonded to a commander who paid them, fed them, and gave them honors. The clang of state-forged pila and the gleam of a newly asserted aquila were also promises written in iron. In the long shadow of that winter's decision, Rome made a path for distant conquest, and perhaps without fully intending it, for commanders whose power would rest not merely on the Senate's sanction, but on the loyalty of thousands whose only sure entitlement was the man who had fed and led them. Which general then will hold the next promise, and at what cost to the city whose fields have been left to fallow? Orange, Arausio, late autumn 105 BCE. The Rhone Valley filled with a stench that would haunt Rome for years: smoke from burning wagons, the copper tang of blood, and the moan of survivors among the corpses. 2 Roman armies, commanded by consuls quarreling over command, were cut to pieces by migrating tribes called the Cimbri and Teuton. Sources estimate between 40 and 80 dead. The decision that followed in Roma was immediate in its cruelty. Panic. The city had not merely lost soldiers, it had suffered a civic rupture. Men who had once answered the levy as farmers who returned to plow and hearth now seemed insufficient to the task of defending Italia from a storm from the north. Into that void stepped Gaius Marius in 107–104 BCE in Rome, and then on the Alpine front. Faced with dwindling property, qualified recruits, and enraged citizens, he refused the old logic that a man must first own land to fight. He took volunteers, many from the capite censi, the head count poor, and made a pragmatic decision: the army must carry itself. Marius organized supplies through contracts, standardized equipment, and forced men to bear their own burdens. He drilled them until each soldier could march long days carrying his pack like a beast of burden. Contemporaries called them muli. The action was brutal, an attrition of fatigue and skill. Plutarch and Appian record the rigor of these seasons: long marches across cold passes, midnight exercises, and the tightening of unit cohesion into the century cohort that modern historians see as the backbone of later Roman legions. At Aquae Sextiae 102 BCE, and then at Versailles 101 BCE, those decisions became deeds. In the scrub and marshes of southern Gallia, and on the plain of the Po Marius's drilled veterans met the migrating tribes and broke them. The sensory truth of those battles is stark: the thunder of Pila, the screams of horses, the metallic ring, as standards were planted on foreign soil. Victory did not restore the old arrangement. Action produced consequence, an army forged in continuous campaigns, loyal not to fields, but to commanders who had fed them, clothed them, and promised land and booty as recompense. For the men who had spent years without plows, the prospect of discharge without means was intolerable. What does a man fight for when his plow is gone? Back in Rome in 100 BCE, the tribune Saturninus answered with law and threat. He pushed through a land bill to settle Marius's veterans on public lands, linking a commander's survival to the distribution of reward. The political choice was stark: feed the legions or face their fury. The consequences rippled immediately. Veterans who had marched under Marius now expected concrete recompense, and political life became a market where the price of loyalty was measured in allotments and donativa. The forward pull of these years is not simply military reform, but a change in allegiance. Where once the Republic relied on acres and seasonal service, it now faced an army whose bond was transactional and personal. A victorious consul could settle his men, a failed one could find his city open to blades. In the space of a decade, the image of the citizen soldier answering the Doctus had been transformed into a rank file that kept its eyes on the field commander's purse and promises. Rome had forged a savior in Marius, but the bargain that saved Italia at Aquae Sextii, and Versailles, also planted a question at the heart of the Republic: who would feed the legions when the eagles returned home? The camp smelled of iron and smoke. Hispania's scrublands full of Sertorius, rebel, banners, the scrubby flats of Capua haunted by the clink of slave chains, and the dull thud of new recruits drilling with wooden poles. Sertorius, in exile from Rome, turned local discontent into a rival state, offering land, law, and the protection of a stable command to men whom the Republic's centuries-old system had abandoned. His decision was simple and brutal: where the Senate could not secure soldiers, a man with imperium and pay could. He built networks of loyalty, clients, veteran colonists, Iberian allies, and by action transformed marginal farmers and dispossessed peasants into a political army that taxed, garrisoned, and spoke for Hispania as if it were a state. Meanwhile, in Italy, the same calculus played out in reverse. Pompey, restless and ambitious, began to raise men without waiting for the usual magistracy. What mattered more than legal titles was the ability to recruit, equip, and keep men in the field. Rome's magistrates could command law, strongmen commanded pay. When legions could be raised by purse and promise rather than by property, and vote, the link between soldier and field, between soldier and soil, was broken. The Republic's old compact that the farm made the man and the man made Rome frayed into a new bargain: loyalty for land, loyalty for donativa, bonuses for obedience. Then the slave war burned everything raw. In the cattle lands and amphitheaters, a gladiator named Spartacus forged a rebel force that learned discipline and march angles as quickly as any Roman cohort. For 2 years the state failed to crush him. The decision to send a man with money rather than prestige was made by Marcus Crassus. He raised 6 legions, drilled them without pause, and applied a punishment meant to terrify. He ordered decimatio, a ritual killing of 1 in 10 men chosen by lot, a discipline measure designed to restore order by communal terror. Soldiers flinched as the queasy metallic tang of blood mixed with the smoke of burning huts. Fear became method. Crassus then paid his way to victory: cash for recruits, cash for supply convoys, cash to bribe adversaries, and his triumph was ugly and emphatic. Sources estimate between 6,000 and 6,600 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, a deliberate spectacle of cruelty meant to rewrite expectation. This was the new arithmetic: money plus menace rewrote Republican practice. The Senate, impotent and terrified by disorder, yielded to those who could actually put men in the field. Veterans returned from campaigns with no plow to go back to, and with a growing habit of looking to one man for reward. Donativa, gifts of money to soldiers, shifted from extraordinary largesse into political necessity. Commanders who could promise land bonuses or settled colonies became brokers of men's futures. They bartered law for loyalty. The decision to prioritize immediate recruitment and settlement over the old census rules produced legions that answered first to their benefactor, and only secondarily to Rome's institutions. The consequence reached beyond Spartacus' chains. Armies now marched to promote patrons rather than policies. Soldiers learned that campaigning could mean pensions, plots, and donatives from a single generous hand. They learned, too, that the spears they carried could drive policy at home. Rome had traded the yeoman farmer for the professional client soldier, and the politics of the forum began to reflect the rhythm of the camp. One man's purse could make him a power broker. One legion's loyalty could tilt the republic's balance. What followed was no longer a debate about law, but a contest of provision who could feed, arm, and settle men on the cheap. The next commanders, Caesar, Pompey, Antony, would answer that question in coin and conquest. And so the listener should imagine, as dusk falls over a line of marching men, the great question left hanging in the dust: who will now buy the loyalty of Rome's soldiers, and at what price? A winter night in Gallia Comata, campfires scrawl light across wet ground. The smell of leather and boiled pork hangs in the air, and the standards, the Aquili eagles, gleam wet as knives. Gaius Julius Caesar sits by a brazier, not only directing marches, but composing commentary to be read in Rome. The same hand that signs orders also scripts victory for the public. Who owns a soldier? That question, once rhetorical, had begun to demand an answer in coin. Caesar's decision was pragmatic and ruthless. Rome's old bargain, the landholder who fought a season and returned to his plow, no longer fed campaigns that stretched into a decade. With 8 legions, roughly 40,000 men at his back, Caesar could not rely on farms to refill ranks. The legal cover of prorogatio allowed him to remain proconsul, but holding imperium in the field meant needing more than legal papers. It required pay, plunder, and promises. He chose to buy time and men. The action took 3 forms. First, Caesar turned Gallic booty into immediate currency. Towns sacked treasure, carted back, and crowds of soldiers paid their donativa. Second, when plunder fell short, he borrowed from bankers, from Italian patrons, from his own household funds, to smooth wages and to fund large-scale distributions. Third, he cultivated a political narrative. His commentaries, dry, precise reports of battles and sieges, were also a ledger of merit broadcast, so the forum would see who brought victories and who brought spoils. Soldiers who had no fields to return to felt in the clink of denarii, a tangible tether to him, rather than to the abstract res publica. Consequences unfurled across winter quarters and spring advances. Men who once counted on household plots now kept only saddles and spears. The plow was a foreign thing in their hands. Their pensions and hope for plots depended on Caesar's largesse's favor and the terms he negotiated in camp. Loyalty began to look like a ledger entry, one donative, now 2, after a big victory, a promise of land later. The cohort ceased to be simply a civic duty and became in practice a private retinue. When Caesar trained them, he trained not only tactics but expectations. That service would be repaid by the man who had fed them. This was not mere bookkeeping. The soldiers, dependents, altered choices in hard moments. When political storms in Rome threatened to strip him of command, Caesar had a living instrument that owed its material survival to him. The crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BCE, then, was not only a legal provocation, it was a logistical one. He led forward men who had marched with him for years, men whose boots bore the mud of Gallic winters and whose hands had counted his coins. They carried no plows, only eagles. Their future lay with the commander who had kept their bellies full and their children hopeful of land. The image is small, but telling a centurion fingers a purse the coin inside still warm from the camp chest, and across a shallow river the city waits. Civil war in this moment is as much about payroll as it is about strategy. The immediate consequence is simple and brutal. A man with pay in his hand can turn a levy into an army. The broader consequence is political. A republic founded on citizen soldiers now faces an army whose first allegiance can be bought, and that buying changes who can claim power. As the eagles step onto the icy bank and Caesar's standards blot the horizon, the question that follows is not merely who will win the crown, but who will keep the purse. The coin's clink has replaced the fallow field as the sound that determines Rome's fate. A wet dawn on the Danube, campfires sputter, tents cling with frost, and men who have served 2 decades mutter, not of glory, but of hunger and home. When Augustus died in AD 14, Tiberius inherited an empire, and the first tremor of a new age. In Germania and on the Rhine, veteran centurions and raw recruits alike confronted the calculus of service. Tacitus records the complaint plainly: men demanded shorter terms and a larger stipendium. The old bargain, leave your plow for a season, return with harvests intact, had unraveled. Tiberius faced a choice rooted in politics and precedent: answer the camps with generosity and set a costly precedent, or crack down and risk open revolt. He chose a mixed path. He sent Germanicus to the Rhine and Pannonia, a calculated decision to meet mutiny with a man who could sway soldiers by oratory and by the threat of discipline. Germanicus rode into the ravaged encampments, spoke to the men, and where words failed he enforced order. The winter's misery was both explanation and excuse for the commander's iron hand. The result was temporary quiescence, but the act revealed something more dangerous: loyalty could now be negotiated and purchased at the frontier. The imperial household learned quickly that armies were no longer mere instruments of state policy, but claimants on the state's purse. The next decades deepened that lesson. In Rome, the Praetorian Guard, a force of roughly 90 men clustered around the city, became a prize in its own right. Claudius bought their votes with donativa. Nero, early in his reign, raised soldiers' pay again and lavished bonuses to secure favor, as Suetonius notes. Yet cash could not buy esteem. Excesses at home, failures abroad, and the perception that the emperor preferred spectacle to strategy hollowed out respect. Pay became bribe rather than bond. By 68, the threadbare loyalty frayed into catastrophe. Then came the year 69. 4 emperors in 12 months, and armies that once marched under Rome's name now crowned rulers. In Germania, the legions proclaimed Vitellius on the Danube, others backed Galba, and then Otho in the east. The Syrian armies threw their weight behind Vespasian. Dio Cassius and the historians paint a grim arithmetic: soldiers who had been promised donatives or discharged land now held the keys of succession. The decision to proclaim a commander emperor was practical, who could put bread and coin in the men's hands. But it was also ideological. The army declared that military power, not senatorial procedure, made Rome's princeps. The consequence was fiscal and constitutional. The imperial treasury bent beneath escalating wages, repeated donativa, and the need to keep troops fed on distant frontiers where supply lines were long and winters cruel. A single legion, roughly 50 men, meant not only pay but grain, clothing, and the expectation of future rewards, land grants or lump sum bonuses. The state moved from underwriting campaigns to underwriting allegiance. Political authority migrated from the curia to the camp. The mos maiorum of civilian supremacy gave way to imperium, congenial to the man who commanded a swordarm and a purse. Listen to the image in the forum. 1,000 citizens might watch a consul speak, but beyond the Alps, a single standard-bearer could decide who would wear the purple. The army had become kingmaker, its banners the ballots of a martial electorate, and Rome's leaders discovered that the fastest road to power ran through the pay chest. As the empire extended, and its frontiers strained, the question hardened into a threat: if emperors rule by paying soldiers, who will pay when coin runs out and the limes, those frontier defenses, begin to fray. The answer would arrive in clashing eagles burning cities, and the succession of men crowned by the shouts of legions rather than the votes of men in togas. Dawn on the campus Martius dust the tang of iron and the low bellow of oxen as Rome's men gather to be counted. The scene is civic and agricultural at once. Plow handles thrust into the earth a few hours before, now held like spears, a trumpet calls the Dauctus, the city's summons to arms. The decision Rome had long made and made again at every muster was political and practical fight with those who had most to lose. The Servian census attributed to the reforms of a dead king's memory sorted citizens into classes by property, so that the burden of defense fell on the landholders who could equip themselves. Those judged too poor for gear, the capite censi, stood at the edge of the plain counted but excluded from the battle line. Action followed from law and habit. Men presented themselves before officers' ranks were formed not by uniform but by farm and fortune. Armor came from household stores, not the state shields were the shields of fathers and sons. Livy and Dionysius describe this militia as civic ritual as much as military a city, calling its plowmen vine dressers and shepherds to fight then to return to the harvest. The arrangement encoded a belief, the mos maiorum of duty tied to property, that Rome's strength was measured in acres under plow, not in barracks. A tenant who owned land was thought likeliest to stand his ground to bear arms without becoming a political tool. But every decision carries its hidden costs. A farmer's absence is a calendar problem. Sowing and reaping do not wait for diplomacy. What happens when a father is gone for 6 weeks? When campaigns stretch into months, barns sit unattended and debts accumulate. Polybius will later note fines for evasion, and a seasonal rhythm that assumes farms endure. Even by the late 5th century, Livy hints that pay, stipendium, creeps into the ledger because a man with no income will sooner slip his obligations. Imagine a muster where 1,000 men, more than half of them smallholders, look not at banners, but at furrows they cannot leave unturned. What if war outlasts the harvest? The plain itself offers theater and omen. Vexilla flutter tubi and cornu pierce the morning centurion's bark commands, as if drilling a triplex achais amid the plows. Priests take the auspices, examining entrails, reading light on a cloud, and superstition can delay a levy as surely as a rotten year. The scent of sweat, pitch, river mud, and lamp oil mixes with the smell of turned earth, oxen low from the flocks still in harness. Magistrates calculate annona in the forum and think of Ostia's granaries. A poor harvest threatens more than a few colonias. It threatens the city's capacity to feed an army away from home. Men think of Gloria and Dignitas of Timor. A commander's ambition may summon them, but superstition and hunger can keep them from answering. Consequence arrives in 2 forms: economic strain and social strain. Fields left untended produce fewer olives, and less grain creditors gather in the forum, with rich households fracture when sons do not return at season's end. As Rome pushes beyond her hills into Latium and Etruria, those short punitive expeditions become longer enterprises of conquest and garrison. The seasonal bargain phrase landowners begin to sell or rent to slave labor. The pool of property qualified recruits thins, and the city finds itself summoning fewer men who meet the census test. The ancient tether that bound soldier to soil slackens. The levy still drums across the campus Martius, but increasingly the drumbeats answer a city whose battles will soon demand soldiers who do not, or cannot, go home at harvest. Who will feed Rome when her men cannot feed their fields? The campus Martius in 406 BCE smelled of dust, sweat, and the metallic clink of coin, a sound that shifts a republic's logic. Livy records that in that year the Senate, faced with campaigns that kept men from their plows, ordered a stipendium to be laid into the ledger, less a gift than a purchase, a bargain to buy time away from the fields. The decision was practical and perilous. Rome's old war order, the Dauctus, a summons of landholders who answered in season and then returned to sowing, relied on farms that could survive a campaign's absence. Polybius, writing 2 centuries later, describes that same order as disciplined and calibrated to property where fines punished evasion, and the seasonal rhythm assumed harvests would wait. But what happens when the harvest does not wait? What happens when war becomes years instead of months? The Punic conflicts supplied the answer. Extended service against Carthage stretched the stipendium from short-term consolation into a necessary wage, and that wage could not restore what absence and enemy raids had taken. Men who once measured their worth by acres found debts swelling like winter water. Creditors in the Forum sharpened their ledgers, while veteran families saw barns rot and olive groves fall to neglect. Polybius's neat levy, classes fines returning harvests, began to leak. The state sent coins it could not send seed oxen or a repaired thrashing floor. Victory multiplied obligations, colonies to plant garrisons to man and retired soldiers who expected land as recompense for years of service. 1,000 such stories could be read in the geometry of ruined holdings, terraces, untended vineyards wild with brambles, a widow turning coins into grain at a market where prices had risen. The stipendium became paradoxically both solution and symptom, pay to keep men under arms, and a signal that the old link between property and military duty was fraying. Merchants and publicani, who handled war supplies, learned to auction equipment, and loans commanders learned that steady pay attracted men with no fields to return to. The moral economy of service changed into a monetary economy of dependence. That change carried consequences beyond the countryside. Rome had long been careful to tie military obligation to the mos maiorum, the shared habit that kept citizen soldiers tied to farms and to the Senate's authority. The new reliance on stipendium undermined that. Informal bond soldiers began to look to paymasters and commanders for their livelihoods, not merely to ancestral duty. As men accumulated war pay, and as estates in Italy consolidated, sometimes bought with the very spoils war had produced, the city's social map altered. Veterans who returned to ruined plots found themselves bargaining in the Forum rather than plowing a field, and their grievances were legible arrears, unpaid promises of land, postponed debts that no coin alone could repair. The decision to pay was at once fiscal cleverness and political trap. It kept the legions marching through campaigns that won empire, but it also deputized Rome's soldiery into the markets and magistracies of the city. Coins eased immediate need. They did not restore the invisible capital of a landholder standing the single acre that once qualified a man for the line and anchored his loyalty to the res publica. As veterans filed back toward the Forum, with their packs, their wounds, and the small bronze of stipendium jangling in their purses, the question no longer was merely tactical: who would lay claim to the Italian soil, and at what price would Rome redeem its promise? In the Forum, Caligae clattered, tubi split the air, senators tallied annona shortfalls, while commanders feared arrears could spark mutiny. Who now would claim Italy's Senate ledger, or a general's sword? Smoke lay low over Corfinium and Esculum, iron rang from 100 campfires, and the smell of dust and burned grain cut across the hills like a summons. Men who had farmed those hills for generations now slept under tents and mended torn standards, and the countryside itself had become a courtroom Italy demanded to be counted. The socii, long bound to Rome by obligation and tribute, had taken up arms, in a secession that historians reckon at roughly 100 fighting men, and what met them was not merely legionaries, but a republic forced to answer a political question with a military hand. What did Rome do when Italy demanded the vote? Faced with pitched battles from Corfinium to Esculum, and the risk that seasoned Italian cohorts would never return to loyalty, the Senate, grudging fearful of precedent, made a decision that was as much arithmetic as mercy. Rome extended civitas in stages, a legal recognition that folded whole communities into the Roman body politic. Appian and Sallust make plain the calculation enfranchisement would drain the fire of revolt by turning enemies into voters, and it would hugely expand the pool of men available for the Dauctus. The choice was practical as well as political. Rome bought peace by granting rights, and in doing so reshaped the sources of its military manpower. The immediate action was decisive and costly. As new citizens took the oath, the city assembly list swelled. Men who had once stood outside the property-based levy now qualified for the shield and sword. The state assumed the burden of outfitting these recruits more often than before. Stipendium and state supply supplanted the old model where a farmer's plow furnished his spear and kit. The aerarium and annona creaked under the strained granaries, and the cursus publicus were pressed to funnel provisions and equipment to castra that no longer emptied with the harvest. The transformation cut two ways. Rome won bodies to fill the lines, but it also relinquished a mode of control. Where the levy had been a rural rhythm, men leaving for the campaign seasoned to return to fields, the new recruits were urbanized, indebted, and beholden to whoever delivered pay, land, or booty. That vacuum of loyalty proved a chance for ambitious commanders. Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla turned victories into patronage. They promised allotments, promotions, and shares of spoils. Veterans who had been citizens 1 week and settlers the next found their fortunes tied not to the Senate's distant decrees, but to the imperium of individual generals who could secure lands and money. In camp, the symbolism was plain: aquila and vexilla planted before tents, laurel wreaths promised for future triumphs, tubi and cornua calling the ranks, symbols that bound men as tightly as any law. Centurions kept discipline with caligae sounding on packed earth while soldiers watched for prodigies, bad omens read in entrails, and traded rumors of who would pay the next donative. Plutarch and later commentators watched this well-formed soldiers commoning their fortunes with a man who had raised, fed, and rewarded them. The levy held, Rome still fielded legions, and the Italian provinces remained largely pacified. But those bonds ran down the column to the man at the head, not up to the curie on the capitale. Tactically and logistically, the change mattered. Armies that once mustered in a triplex Achaies for seasonal campaigns now stayed in the field for years. Auxilia and Italian cohorts were folded into longer service. The state's payroll grew, the aerarium was stretched as the Republic equipped more men, and absorbed the costs of campaigns that now lasted not seasons but years. Politically, the consequence was grimmer. A soldier's oath could be satisfied either by the Senate's decrees or by the direct largesse of a commander who guaranteed pensions, plots, and legal favor. Sulla would soon teach how fast a legate's loyalty could be rerouted into marching orders for Rome itself. 100 standards planted in newly enfranchised towns, each aquila a promise, each man awaiting the next donative. Who, when the next crisis comes, will a legion follow? The state that coins its pay or the captain who keeps his word? The smell of smoke and hot metal hung over the streets of Rome, as if the city itself had been butchered. Trumpets cut the dusk and citizens peered from rooftops to see standards advance where once only magistrates walked. The aquila and vexilla shivered under torchlight, tubi and cornua blared, scuda rang, and caligae clattered on stone, while auguries and superstition were trampled in the dust. For 5 centuries, the Republic had fielded men who left the plow for the spear seasonally, called up by the Dauctus that drew soldiers according to property, and returned to fields that were their wealth and civic stake. Those were the terms of Rome's power: land paid your armor, and the mos maiorum linked soldiering to soil. By 88 BCE, those terms were fraying. Landless men clustered in the subura. The capite censi increasingly looked to the army not as a civic duty, but as a wage. What happens when the man who feeds your family stands over the magistrate? That question was answered in iron. Sulla's decision was legal grievance dressed in fatal liberty. He had been consul and legally assigned command in the east, but politics in the forum tried to strip him of that imperium. Rather than litigate in the courts, he went to the one resource that could not be appealed: his legions. From their cantons, he drew 6 legions, some 30,000 men hardened by the social war and hungrier for pay and plunder than for precedent, and marched them toward Rome. Crossing the Pomerium with armed men was unthinkable. Sulla did it by choice, believing force a form of law. Plutarch and Appian record soldiers who obeyed him not because the Senate bade it, but because the promise of spoils and retirement at his hand outweighed abstract republican restraint. The action was swift and brutal. Gates were broken, neighborhoods set aflame, where resistance gathered, and tribunes and senators who had moved against him found that the spear had become a vote. Sulla's choice to use military violence was accompanied by an administrative cruelty. He pioneered proscriptio, a bureaucratic terror that auctioned names and property and sold death itself into the market. Money from confiscated estates and state-captured wealth supplied settlements. Veteran coloniae were founded, and veteran land grants welded fortunes to a single patron's goodwill. Where once a legionnaire returned to a plot of family soil, now a settlement could stand or fall on a commander's favor. The consequence was structural and immediate. Rome's army had ceased to be merely the instrument of the Senate and become an arm of personal power. Men who had formerly been farmers now viewed military service as a career. The stipendium mattered as much as the plow. Veterans installed in coloniae owed their new status and their pensions to Sulla's largesse and to the terror that enforced his law. Appian and Plutarch see in these years not only reprisals, but a reordering by decree. Law and reprisal braided into governance. In practical terms, the Republic exchanged civic habit for clientage. Commanders who could recruit, feed, and settle men acquired politics as their spoil. Across Italy, the image settled standards over the forum veterans in a town whose taxes had paid for their loyalty. One man's march had taught an immutable lesson. Arms could make law, and land could be bought with blood. Spears could rewrite law, towns bought with blood. Dawn over Rome smelled of coin, and smoke carts rattled past the forum with bundles of confiscated deeds, and veterans, mud on their boots from winter campaigns, crowded the campus. Marius to collect what the state now promised them. The decision that followed Caesar's fall was stark and deliberate. Antony and Octavian, two men with soldiers but no instant claim to a restored republic, chose to convert violence into loyalty by turning men's need into political currency. They opened a proscriptio and emptied private purses, names struck from safety, estates seized, and the proceeds moved, fast, liquid, and easily counted, into the hands of soldiers and surviving clients. Coins clinked where acres had once been. Midway through the bidding for power, one could hear a simple calculation echoing through camp and market alike. Who controls the purse controls the spear. Action followed with ruthless efficiency. Appian records towns stripped of their taxpayers to supply veteran settlements. Italian fields that had fed local militias were carved up for veteran coloniae. Plots promised to those who had marched under legionary eagles for years. At Philippi, where the liberators faced the triumviral armies, 19 legionary standards met in a decision. Not only tactical but fiscal, men who had wintered in distant provinces now counted their loyalty in donativa and land allotments. At Perusia, and again on the Ionian Sea at Actium, entire legions swung the balance simply by choosing which bidder would pay best, and which patron could guarantee a plot at home when the sword was sheathed. The consequence was immediate and structural. Municipal treasuries were hollowed to support pensions and settlements. Ordinary taxpayers bore new levies so that veterans might receive their allotments. Towns emptied as families sold or lost holdings. Villas rose where mixed smallholdings once fed the civic levy. The old republican bargain, that soldiers were temporary citizens who returned to plows, fractured into a new calculus. A soldier was a dependent client whose future turned on his commander's generosity. In practice, that meant the stipendium and the donativum became instruments of politics as effective as the legion itself. Veterans who once farmed now measured a commander's worth by paydays and promise, and the army's voice in Rome grew louder for every coin it received. This was not abstract arithmetic, but a social reshaping. Men who had once been seamen agriculturiae, seeds of the countryside, found themselves rooted instead in camps and colonies that answered to a single imperium. The Republican magistracies and old magistrates found their authority undermined, because the men enforcing decisions in the field owed fealty to generals who could hand them immediate reward. The spectacle was unmistakable. The legions voted with spears. Cities emptied, tax rolls thinned, and the sound of legal auction replaced the rhythm of the plowshare. A rhetorical question cuts clean through the calculus. When the Republic pays its defenders from the spoils of its own citizens, who then is protector, and who the protected? The triumviral settlements bought temporary stability, but set a new precedent. Money seized by force would bind soldiers to patrons, and patronage would now be purchased with lands and largesse. One victor would remain from the struggle of 44 to 31 BCE, and he would take this lesson and turn it into policy and empire balanced on payrolls rather than plows. The last image is of a long line at the mint, and the shadow of a legion's eagle falling across an emptied countryside, payment in hand, peace for sale. Tubi and Cornua blared Caligae, stamped the Annona groaned as grain was diverted to Castra. Who will feed the legions when the coffers fail? The city of Rome in the years after Actium smelled of wood smoke oil, and the tanned leather of armor stacked in the campus. Martius soldiers stood in rank beneath the shadow of the Capitol, but they no longer looked like the seasonal husbandmen who marched off to the levee a century earlier. In 27 BCE, from Roma to the Rhine, Octavian, now Augustus, faced a decision that was as much logistical as political: how to stop the cycle of proscriptions, proconsular armies and veterans returning penniless to ruined plots, while still securing an empire whose frontiers demanded constant garrisons. He chose to buy permanence. The act was deliberate. He fixed service terms, roughly 16 years for many, rising in practice toward 20 or more, so that a man could plan a life not around planting and harvest, but around pay, discipline, and eventual discharge. He created the aerarium militaire, funded by new levies on inheritances and other receipts, to make the army pay independent of sudden proscriptions or a generous patron's whim. He regularized the donativa, discharge bonuses, and arranged for veterans to be settled in colonies, and in the res gesti, he boasts of the towns refounded and the money he put into those grants himself. What did he buy with coin? The answer was fidelity, a force whose oath bound it to the princeps, and a guard in the city the cohorts praetorii paid at a premium and kept close to the imperial household. Augustus did not merely pay soldiers, he remade their career arc, turning service into a predictable contract of years' wages, and a final pension that could be advertised in the forum, as surely as a consulship could be promised in a senatorial speech. Standards, the aquili and vexilla, dominated the parades. Tubi and Cornua signaled routine, an alarm Caligae clacked on stone, and camps smelled of pitch oil and river mud. The aerarium tied into the Annona, and the cursus publicus, so that pay, forage, and transport could be coordinated. The visible order of standards and roads masked a fragile dependence on coin and corn. The choice suited Roman ideology too. He wrapped professionalization in the language of restored mos maiorum. But the alteration was practical: fewer disposable levies, better trained cohorts, and a permanent military presence that could hold rivers like the Rhine against restless Germans. The action required administrative invention, recruitment, standardized kit, fixed terms, and the fiscal apparatus to meet payments even in lean years. The immediate consequence was a visible stability. Legions settled into forts, veterans accepted assignments in distant colonies, and the urban streets saw fewer bands of armed ex-recruits marauding for land or loot. Scholars such as Fergus Miller's school have traced the steady bureaucracy behind these reforms, and modern readers most often hear the verdict of Peter and Adrian Goldsworthy and Andrew Ando, who argue that Augustus replaced the old militia with a managed profession. an army whose loyalty ran to pay and patron rather than to a temporary civic levy. Ancient chroniclers notice the change. The res gesti advertises settlements, and later writers record how the guard's pay became a political instrument. Yet the bargain contained its own peril. Soldiers now expected regular paydays, reliable pensions, and the habit of being rewarded by the man whose power preserved those things. The aerarium militaire could be topped up, the donative could be enlarged, but the precedent of buying an army had been set. Augustus, quiet invention of career soldiers, bought a pax that looked orderly on the surface. Beneath it, a new arithmetic of rule had been written. Emperors would be judged by their coffers as much as by their legislations. Picture an imperial clerk counting small bronze coins as a cohort waits under arms. The thud of hobnailed boots, a reminder that loyalty once purchased could also be withheld. A single withheld donativum could topple an emperor. Night settled like tar over the encampment on the Via Flaminia. Torches, guttering against the cold as men whose names once belonged to villages now kept watch for a different city. The air was awash of sweat, horsehair, and the metallic clink of coins newly minted for distribution. Septimius Severus had chosen a decision that tasted of iron and arithmetic. Rather than beg the Senate, he would take Rome by force, and he would bind his fate to the soldiers who followed him. The march on Roma in 193 CE was not merely a seizure of streets and gates, but a charter in cash. Severus raised the stipendium by roughly a third, enlarged the donativum, and formally permitted connubium for men who had long lived with wives, in practice if not in law. What buys an emperor? Not only victory on the field, but payrolls and promises, Severus seemed to say, and he spent accordingly. When commanders decide to pay with gold rather than land, the nature of loyalty itself changes. Troops who once tied their allegiance to patchwork farms and ancestral rights now counted years' coins, and the man who signed their discharge. Archaeology records this shift in stone and bronze. Veteran coloniae sprout at provincial edges, and military diplomas multiply in the epigraphic record as receipts of imperial largesse. Dio Cassius, writing in indignation, and with the eye of a senator, lamented an empire now governed from the camp rather than through the Senate's gates, and his tone captures the political consequence. Authority migrated to where the standards and pay chest stood. A single legio could by its mood and purse make or unmake the title of princeps. Even ritual and sound bent to the new court. The Aquila and Vexilla acquired the weight of crowns. Tubi and Cornua, that once called men to battle, now sounded round-the-clock salutes to a paymaster on horseback. Superstitio and Timor threaded through camp life. Centurions watched auspices. Before campaigns, soldiers read prodigies as omens for donativa, and the frequent lighting of incense at field shrines began to resemble an imperial cult in miniature. At the same time, logistics spoke plainly. The Annona shipped from Ostia granaries on the Tiber, and the cursus publicus that moved coin and orders were as decisive as any legionary cohort. When the granary failed or the wagons lagged, morale frayed. Caligae rang hollow on stone, and murmurs of mutiny became audible. Severus's policy answered immediate needs. Veterans required settlement, the army demanded discipline and reward, and a ruler needed the certainty of loyalty that coin could buy. Yet action breeds consequence. Cash turned allegiance brittle, and transactional commanders discovered that the quickest route to power was to promise more than Rome's treasury could sustain. Colonies intended to solve a veteran's future instead tied whole communities to imperial largesse. Soldiers who had exchanged the plow for the pilum began to see promotion and pay as the proper fruits of service, not the civic obligations of a citizen farmer. The chain of command now ran through barracks and camps, where political decisions were made under standards and on the roll call. Emperors learned to think in donativa and deployment, and rival officers learned the same arithmetic. By 235 CE, the logic had run its course. Severus Alexander, the last of the dynasty's cautious end, stood on a parched frontier where pay and glory had become the coin of imperial legitimacy, and his troops, impatient with perceived weakness and cheap promises, turned a campaign into an execution. The murder was not merely personal tragedy, but the visible collapse of a bargain, the crown delivered to the man who could best supply camp comforts and coin. From the ashes of that killing rose decades in which fortresses and payrolls, not senatorial debate, decided who would rule. The image endures of tents arrayed like a court across the plains, each one a possible throne. What happens when the annona fails and coins stop?